Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're watching from around the world. My name is Vivian Salama. I'm a national security correspondent with CNN, and it's a pleasure to bid you all welcome to this webinar with the Alliance of Democracies Foundation called Building an Alliance of Democracies. It's part of the foundation's ongoing webinars for #DefendDemocracy. So 2021 could be the year where concrete steps are taken to build an alliance of democracies. The Biden administration has promised a summit of democracy, which could galvanize the free world. The United Kingdom, as president of the G7, intends to expand its meeting this summer to include Australia, South Korea, and India, strengthening cooperation around the world with the major democracies, the so-called D10. I have some excellent speakers with experience to talk about all these issues, and it's truly a pleasure to be with them. First, and most important, perhaps, because he's our host, former Prime Minister of Denmark and former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who is also now the chairman of the Alliance of the Democracies Foundation. Sir, thank you for joining us. We are hoping that Lord Mark Sedwill is going to be joining us. He's a few minutes late, but the G7 envoy for the economic resilience and the former cabinet secretary and national security advisor to Boris Johnson. Hopefully he'll be joining us in a few minutes. And then of course, here on my side of the pond, we have Michael Carpenter, managing director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. Mike, good to have you. And we also have a digital grassroots organizer, Colom Cahen Salvador, co-founder of Now, a movement campaigning for a League of Democracies and for #Fridays for Freedom. It's great to have you all here. Just some important housekeeping tips before we get started. If you like to ask questions to our speakers, we encourage you to do so. We are all spread out. Of course, this is not ideal. We'd rather all be in a room together, but of course, anyone from home, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So go onto the Q&A button down on the Zoom chat. Send us your questions. No questions are too hard or too soft. We want to really get an engaging discussion, so please don't be shy. You can also watch this on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, and you can leave comments in the field and use the #DefendDemocracy. So we want to spend about 60 minutes together, and I will kick off our discussion with one question for each panelist. But before we do that, we thought we'd start with a little quick interactive activity for those of you joining us via Zoom. We have a poll question for everyone, and that question you'll see now is, the poll is now blocking my view, is how important do you think it is for democracies to stand and work more closely together? And your options are A, very important, and we can do better among democracies; B, important, but will not make a big difference; C, not important to solving global problems; and D, bad idea that will lead to bloc formation of the world. I'll give you a moment to do that. Please send us your answers, let us know your thoughts, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we have our results. 95% of you said, how important do you think it will be? It was said very important. We do think we can do better among democracies. And so obviously that's going to be a very important perspective that we're going to take away with us. We also had folks online chiming in, and they said also 100% that it is very important. So we'll go from there. Also, I'm told that Mark Sedwill is now with us, but we're still having some technical difficulties. Lord Sedwill, we see that you're here. I hope that we can loop you in at some point, but we're going to try to sort out those technical difficulties so you can also see Lord Sedwill momentarily. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start with Prime Minister, who I'm told I can just call Anders. I hope that's okay. So your foundation is called Alliance of Democracies, but explain to us why you think that is so important that democracies cooperate together, sir.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and thanks for agreeing to steer our debate today. Actually, you were the journalist to break the story about President Trump wanting to buy Greenland. So your interest in the Kingdom of Denmark is not completely new, and we hope you get to visit us in Copenhagen and Nuuk in Greenland when the pandemic allows it. I'm also delighted to see that we have been able to assemble this solid panel today for an important discussion. Since I left office from NATO, I have continued to work for freedom and democracy. And I have consistently advocated a stronger alliance among democracies. That is also what the foundation is called. It's also the purpose of our yearly Copenhagen Democracy Summit, to gather democracy forces from politics, business, tech, and activism. Last year, as speakers, we had Joshua Wong from Hong Kong, President Tsai Ing-wen from Taiwan, and US Secretaries Pompeo, Kerry, and Albright with us, to the consternation, by the way, of the Chinese government. But let me turn to your initial question. Why do I advocate for an alliance of democracies? Autocrats thrive when the free world is divided. We've seen what happens when the United States retreats from the world and the world's democracies start to put narrow interests ahead of values. Democracy around the world begins to decay. So I believe we need an alliance of democracies for several reasons. Let me just mention three. Firstly, to create a united front of democracies to confront the advancing autocracies. Secondly, to protect and promote freedom and democracy in the world. And thirdly, to reinforce our efforts to develop and strengthen our democratic systems and institutions. Together, the world's free societies represent more than 50% of the global economy. So if we unite, that's a strength that will force China and other autocratic powers to respect international law and the values upon which we have built our free societies. I'm excited that President Biden has suggested a summit of democracy, expectedly in the later part of this year. It is much needed. I know Mike Carpenter will speak much more about that later. I'm also excited to hear about the British chairmanship of G7 consider enlarging into a democracies 10 with Australia, India, and South Korea. That is one way of creating a broader alliance of democracies in practice. I have advocated for such a grouping to arise for a while. Mark Sedgwill will share his thoughts on how the British government is proceeding. These steps make me hopeful that 2021 could lead to a flourishing of cooperation among democracies. That is precisely an overarching theme at this year's Copenhagen Democracy Summit, which we planned for the 10th and 11th of May, and if possible, in a hybrid format physically in Copenhagen. In 2018, Joe Biden and I inaugurated the summit series, and we also worked to curb foreign election interference together under the auspices of the foundation. I hope to see the Biden administration well represented at this year's summit. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you so much. Lord Sedwell, good to have you. We're glad that we sorted out the issues there. So I'm going to just turn to you now. You are still engaged in the practical world of symmetry and the UK's plans for an expanded D10 summit in the summer. What areas would you see as most important for democracies to work together? And what are the practical difficulties in expanding the Club of Democracies?
Well, Vivian, thank you. And Anders, very good to be here with you. I'm sorry I was here for a few minutes just in the audience and managed finally to work my way through to the stage. Sometimes these means aren't quite as easy as just wandering up and finding the right chair, but good to be with you and a great pleasure to participate in this event. On the question you asked, Vivian, I think it is important we look at the context within which we're operating. Anders Fogh Rasmussen just set out this context in which authoritarian states, particularly as we've seen as they seek to recover from COVID, believe that the tide of history is with them and that their model is demonstrating that they're able to deal with a public health crisis and indeed with the economic crisis that has arisen better. And it's therefore a moment in which the democracies do need to double down on the faith in our own system, but demonstrate to our own people that the democratic system, the free market system, as opposed to the authoritarian state capitalist system that rivals us, is actually going to meet their needs. It doesn't mean that people are losing faith in democracy as a whole, but it does mean they lose faith in our systems, and that leads to the rise of populism, protectionism, nationalism, nativism, and so on that we've seen in several countries across the European continent, as well as in North America. The big issues that we need to tackle are, of course, the COVID recovery, but beyond that, the biggest of all, climate, both the net zero agenda and the resilience agenda, given that there's already increasing volatility in the weather and the implications of rising seas, the demographic imbalances in our own societies, which, by the way, are going to be everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa by the middle part of the century. And what does that mean for dependency ratios, migration flows, etc., which of course are highly sensitive politically and socially. The technological revolution, where it's quite clear there is a straightforward struggle to prevail in that, with China wishing to lead the world and set the standards with their Made in China 2025 agenda. And of course, then we see the overall challenge of China seeking under this leadership to export their worldview, whether through a highly assertive approach in their own region, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, etc., or through the Belt and Road Initiative to essentially extend their influence worldwide. And as Anders just said, we have to admit that the democratic world has been fractious for the past few years, but we now need to move beyond that. With Brexit accomplished here in Europe and with the Biden administration in place in the United States, and that agenda that President Biden set out in his election campaign and Anders referred to, of restoring Western unity and unity of purpose, rebuilding relationships with allies, frankly stopping squabbling among ourselves and using economic means to essentially indulge in protectionism among ourselves rather than looking at the resilience of our economies as a whole, is a real opportunity. And we see our G7 presidency in that context. Worth keeping in mind that the G7, even just the G7, if you think of the EU as a whole as a member of it, actually represents in itself almost 60% of the world economy in nominal terms, not in purchasing power parity terms, but in nominal terms. And those two big economic blocs, the United States and the EU, and the next five advanced independent economies, the UK, Japan, Canada, Australia, South Korea, represent almost 2/3 of global GDP. Add to that other big democracies, India, Brazil, etc. And the economic weight of the democratic bloc is truly impressive. And we will need to create that unity of purpose, both to protect our interests and project our values. And we've seen that the democratic system itself is under attack from outside, whether that's cyber attacks or information warfare or dirty money and so on. So national security, the area that Anders Fogh Rasmussen and I both understand probably best, is going to have to encompass democratic security as well as human security, environmental, economic security, and more traditional views of just keeping people safe. So our G7 is going to encompass these three guests. The G7 traditionally invites other countries to join, and there may well be others beyond those three. My own view is it would be a mistake to try and formalize a D10 and create a new boundary with other countries the other side of it. And there'll be other countries like South Africa, Brazil, and others who will wish to associate with much of the agenda, if not all of it, that we're pursuing, as of course India would, as would Indonesia, as might Malaysia, and so on. And so we should be looking to expand this agenda into those countries. And certainly the work we'll be doing on economic resilience in the G7 panel that I'm chairing will be, we will engage widely with the whole of the OECD and indeed other countries as well, in order to try and achieve that unity of purpose that Anders described in the democratic world, and thus be able to assert our interests and values globally against the autocratic model.
Thank you so much for that. We hear you loud and clear. And so given everything that you just said, let's go from across the pond to across the city here in Washington, D.C. Mike, taking into account everything that the first two gentlemen talked about, you're someone who is familiar with President Biden's thinking on certain matters. We obviously have a new administration, so all eyes are on DC at the moment. Some might suggest that you even had played a significant role in getting the Summit of Democracy onto the Biden administration's agenda. So how might the US benefit from such a summit? And when it comes to this concept of democracy and alliances, where does the US stand, and particularly after what happened here on January 6th at the Capitol? How are we to portray here in the US this image of exporting and sharing a democratic value when there's so much questions about where we stand at the United States here?
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. Let me take your last question first, which is that I think traditionally there is this notion of the contest between autocracies and democracies as taking place in various sort of hot points around the world. Belarus, say, for example, or Burma, or Russia. And this is where democratic forces clash with authoritarians who seek to cling to power, or who seek to come to power, as we just saw in Burma. But that is not quite the full picture that we have before us, because in fact, this clash between autocracies and democracies is a global clash. It's taking place, first of all, along various different planes. So there's a military competition, there's an economic side to this, there's a technological side to this, but it's also a clash that is happening within, frankly, each of our societies. And so the events of January 6th, I think, underscored that we have an obligation as democracies to strengthen our own institutions from attacks within, but also at the same time to understand that the weaknesses and vulnerabilities within our own democratic societies are vulnerabilities that our authoritarian adversaries are all too eager to exploit. And so whether it comes to online incitement to violence, that is something that can be done by domestic actors. It's something that can be done by foreign actors. When it comes to dark money channeled to extremist groups, that is a domestic phenomenon, but it is one that foreign actors like China and Russia are all too eager to engage in as well. When it comes to cyber attacks, we also see that coming from domestic sources, but we see it coming from without. So this gets to what Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, likes to talk about, President Biden as well, is this sort of the diminishing differences between domestic policy and foreign policy in a globalized world. And so that's why I think it's so important. And President Biden, has long been a champion of democracy. You go back to the Cold War, his advocacy for NATO membership for the states of Eastern Europe right after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, all of that with an aim to expanding the scope of open societies and individual liberties and democracy around the world. But now, in this current moment that we're in, that's why it's so imperative for the US to lead on this issue, even with humility, because we understand that we too are not immune to the corrosive effect of demagogic populism. But that makes our call for strengthening institutions, I think, all the more credible. And frankly, there's no society on earth that is completely immune to the tugs and pulls of authoritarian influence. And so this is a common agenda that we have with our friends and allies. And, I'm delighted to see that, Mark Sedwill is advancing this within the G7 format to include other allies like India and Australia. But, this is something that is going to be central in all fora, not just the G7 or, the OECD or NATO. This is something that has to be on the agenda for all of us all the time.
Thanks, Mike. Colombe, you advocate online and offline for a League of Democracies that the British G7 chairmanship should kickstart it. And here you are standing outside the UK Parliament. We've got a video here that we want to show. Hopefully it works out. Yep. My screen, the technology, guys, it's a lot sometimes. Here is the video that you're standing outside the UK Parliament on a hashtag Friday for Freedom event. You have your community called Now. And so the question is, where do you take up freedom fights for Hong Kong, Belarus, Russia? What has been your experience in creating a League of Democracies from the bottom up? And since you've heard of the other speakers speaking, you're welcome to any of the thoughts that you might have on where they're coming from, especially from their perspectives and the different nation views.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be able to speak on this panel, especially since a few of the panelists have been receiving emails from me for the last couple of months about the League of Democracies. So it's a great opportunity to relaunch this conversation. So first, let me tell you about the work we've been doing. So I'm one of the founders of Now, which is a global movement trying to solve cross-border issues. And democracy came on our radar when the national security law was introduced in Hong Kong. So just like the Alliance of Democracies, Joshua Wong was one of the early supporters of Now, and he came to us along with a lot of the members we have in Hong Kong, telling us that they've been protesting for many years in an incredible manner, but that with the new law, they needed the international community to act. And not just to issue anti-statements of condemnation, but to actually create targeted economic sanctions against the officials responsible for the crackdown, and to do it together to be stronger. And so the day after the introduction of the national security law, my co-founder, myself, and just another person went in front of the Chinese embassy in Brussels, and we started Fridays for Freedom, surfing on the Fridays for Future movement. And just a week later, we organized protests in over 40 cities on all continents and reached 4 million people online in the midst of the pandemic. And we linked this very quickly to the idea of a League of Democracies, the fact that countries needed to come together, unite, to be able to impose coordinated sanctions when needed, and protect freedom fighters. And soon after, we introduced other struggles from Belarus to Venezuela to Poland, linking the fact that democracy is cross borders and that we all affected when it is being cracked down upon somewhere. And so we started working on the idea of a League of Democracies and targeted the G7, this upcoming G7 in the UK in June, for a simple reason. There's going to be a lot of media attention, and there's some big countries that are democracies that will be there and have the power to kickstart this idea. But we don't want just any League of Democracies with the same old powers coming together and discussing among themselves. We want an innovative one, and one that is more inclusive. So I 100% agree with what the other panelists have said, that we need to show a united front, a strong one against authoritarianism. We see it from China cracking down on Hong Kong to Belarus or Venezuela again. And I agree that countries coming together have a much better chance at protecting freedom fighters by imposing targeted sanctions, coordinating lifeboat policies, and so on. But that's not enough. And I really believe that to create the world of tomorrow, we need to provide a vision of hope and a vision of the future that is not just about the fear of a few authoritarian countries. And so that's why what we want in a League of Democracies as well is a League of Democracies that is capable of holding each member accountable for its own violations on democracies. So there's a saying that I really like that says that democracy is never won, but that it always remains to be won. And I think we've seen it in the US recently. We saw it in my home country, France, as well, with the president trying to pass laws curtailing the freedom to protest. We see it all across the world. And I don't think that as countries and as people, we have a credible voice in telling others that they should be more democratic or that they should embrace democracy if we don't hold ourselves accountable and hold each other accountable. And then there's two last points on this League of Democracy. One is that if we create a League of Democracy that is inclusive, we actually get to learn from one another as well. So there's a lot of very cool experiments being done about democracy. If you look at Taiwan, which is a very recent democratic model, it has created a system of digital democracy that is incredible and enables citizens to really participate meaningfully in its democracy. It's the case with cities like Paris or Madrid that have participatory budget making. So if democracies actually come together and work together and share best practices, we can also really create a better vision of democracy for the future. And then our last point from the ground up for democracy is the fact that this alliance or league, or however you want to call it, of democracies needs to be inclusive. So our activists that are protesting every week since July 3rd in front of government buildings, including here in the UK in front of 10 Downing Street, are not just lobbying G7 countries. They're starting from the G7 because it's a great way of going about it. And again, a few of the members of the panel have received our emails over and over again about this. But they're not just protesting for this or for a G10 with only a few other countries coming. We believe that the same old powers have held a lot of power for way too long and have caused a lot of the issues we're in today. And that this League of Democracies to work needs to be extremely inclusive, not just led by a few countries, but led by all democracies together. So not extending it to a few more countries, but extending it to any democratic countries willing to join and willing to work for a more democratic world. So this is what we're doing. We're still in the midst of it. It's only been 6 months, but we have 10,000 people joining us in those actions on a regular basis, and just normal people like myself lobbying the governments and trying to get the governments to act on this so that we can actually propose a vision of democracy that is made of hope and one where we can actually use new technologies to be able to enable meaningful participation from people all over the world, not just the same old man in the same old rooms taking decisions about the future of the world, and where we get to have all countries participate to create the world of tomorrow. So a quick call to, if any of the members of the panel want to discuss this further and answer our emails, we would really appreciate it. We'll continue to try to lobby the G7 ahead of it for it to take action on this.
Thank you so much, Bloom. Thank you all for those interesting introductory remarks. We have about 15 minutes before we start talking to the audience, and so I thought maybe we freestyle it a little bit in terms of trying to dig deeper into some of these issues. And one of the things I like to do when we're exploring any kind of political theory or any kind of global issues like this is to turn to my old friend Webster Dictionary, the English Language Dictionary, to look at some of the core definitions of some of these issues. And I looked up authoritarianism, true story. This is, maybe I'm a nerd, but that's what I did. I looked up authoritarianism last night just to really kind of go back to the roots. And the Webster Dictionary says that authoritarianism is of or relating to or favoring blind submission to authority. And so I started thinking about it. We just saw video last week in Russia of protesters supporting Alexei Navalny throwing snowballs at police officers. And we see people blatantly protesting against China in Hong Kong. It's hardly a blind submission in the way that a core definition kind of defines it. And so I'm wondering if we can all just start by thinking about what is authoritarianism in 2021 and how do allies, confront this when the definition and the facets of authoritarianism are changing by the day to include everything from covert and cyber, activities and other means, oppression through public health measures, things like that, where it's not just as straightforward as it might have once been. And so maybe we explore that a little more deeply. Maybe Anders, if you want to kick us off, sir.
Yeah, I agree. I think a blind submission, that's not a sufficient definition of authoritarianism. But I would rather confront it another way by defining what do I consider a democratic society. Firstly, of course, free and fair elections. Secondly, free press. Thirdly, freedom of expression. Fourthly, but not unimportantly, rule of law. Just to mention some of the elements that I consider a definition of a democracy. And if a country does not live up to those criteria, I would consider it an authoritarian country. I think we can take a lot of inspiration in the criteria set up by the American think tank Freedom House. They are monitoring the development of freedom and democracy globally every year, and they publish a report every year. I find a lot of inspiration in that. I think that could be a clear guidance of what is democracy and what is an authoritarian system.
Please, everyone jump in if anyone has any thoughts on this. But you mentioned certain things like freedom of the press and rule of law. It makes me think, question, are even some of the Western democracies that we know to be promoting democracy fitting into your definition perfectly? It's not a cookie cutter definition.
So Vivian, if I might,
White House for the last few years, and a lot of these issues popped up.
Vivian, if I might jump in just for a second here, I think the idea that all authoritarian countries resemble Belarus, as Anders has said, is false. Of course, there are police states which rule through terror and repression, and anytime a citizen speaks out against the regime, they're immediately jailed. Those regimes exist. But what we've seen in recent years, and it includes countries in Europe, is a gradual sort of corruption of the institutions of democracy. And I think that's where we have a lot of work to do to strengthen our institutions internally. And often what happens is you see that the accumulation of political power is achieved, for example, by stacking the courts, appointing loyalists to law enforcement and intelligence institutions, denigrating the media as enemies of the people, and in fact, having regime loyal business groups or individuals buy out independent media and toe the party line through their outlets. We see this sort of gradual oligarchization of democracy. It usually happens in tandem with crony capitalism, where you have a sort of a select elite that benefits from government procurement contracts. They're handed out largesse by the state, and gradually, slowly, over the course of many years, they crowd out the space for independent civil society, for independent media, and also for a free market. And we've seen that time and again in various different countries around the world. And I think that's where this notion of an alliance of democracies, we need to double down on our own independent institutions, free media, checks and balances, and independent judiciary. That's why even sometimes when states are still democratic, but they start to trend in this direction, we have to act early before they slide down the path too far. Because once you go down that path, before you know it, you end up like Belarus or Russia.
Lord Sidwell, one of the things that's come up so much in recent months, especially, is trying to find some sort of cohesion among allies against China, specifically when it comes to IP theft, cyberbullying, things like that. And it becomes a little bit complicated when you're in the cyber realm, especially, and you're trying to formulate laws that where everybody can be on board, and it's not a traditional sort of cookie cutter, again, definition of what a democracy sort of looks like, roughly speaking. I mean, how has the UK approached this? Because the UK and the US have not quite agreed on a lot of different issues that have come up, and Germany is another case of it, where you have things like Huawei, IP theft, things like that, 5G issues. Where do allies then come together on issues like this that are emerging technologies and things like that, and try to find a way to confront it from a democratic, a promotion of democracy point of view?
Well, I mean, first, by the way, I agree with both Anders and Mike Carpenter on this. On essentially this point about there being a spectrum, and there's always a risk that countries slide along that in the wrong direction, often under pressure of events. And if their publics are losing faith in the way the democratic system is providing for them. And we saw that after the financial crisis. We've seen it again after COVID, where people just feel the model leaves them behind. And it's all very well us talking about these systems, but if the democratic system doesn't deliver for citizens, then citizens will start to lose faith in it and be more tolerant of some of those insidious abuses of democracy that Michael Carpenter just set out. And essentially that, I think, has to sit at the heart of the way an alliance of democracies operates, whether we're dealing with China or actually among ourselves. Too often, I mean, actually, it's the flip side of what Mike Carpenter was just saying. Too often, procedures have been used that are designed to protect us against genuine national security threats or significant market distortions that have arisen, and we've actually ended up using them against each other. And we saw that under the previous administration, with steel tariffs being imposed on allies, with Mercedes cars being declared a national security threat, or that legislation being used to impose tariffs on Mercedes cars. And if you slide into that kind of behavior and you see mutual protectionism among democracies, essentially against each other, and we're squabbling among ourselves, then we can't possibly try to form a sensible consensus on how to deal with the external challenges, whether they're from the long-term strategic challenge of China or the acute and disruptive threats we face, for example, from Russia. There will always be tactical differences. Should we or shouldn't we attribute cyber attacks, and how fast? At what level of confidence should we proceed if we're actually going to impose sanctions, for example, after the Salisbury attack? There would be even differences of view over that, and that was as an egregious an abuse of the international rule of law as one could imagine. That's fine. Democracy is about argument, and we have to accept there'll be argument between democracies as well. But what we have to remember is that we have an underlying consistent set of values, and that we need to try and present a common sense of purpose, a united front in dealing with those strategic challenges, and not frankly allow ourselves to be played off against each other. So could we have a former NATO Secretary General here, who'll be very familiar with this, could we essentially reach a political agreement among, if not the whole world of the League of Democracies, then a wider group which says, if, to take an example, Australia is picked on by China for standing up for their national interests, we'll all operate in solidarity, a sort of economic, political Article 5. It doesn't have to be as strong as the NATO guarantee, but we could operate in solidarity rather than just issuing, frankly, is what we mostly do, issue a press release deploring it. That way we can avoid smaller countries being picked off by larger ones and make this sense that a democratic league is genuinely purposeful and not just, not just frankly a concept that is meaningful in fora like this, but isn't meaningful to our citizens.
So, Colum, how does the Western world, the Western allies, sort of find a middle ground between the promotion of democracy and then also trying to be realistic about their own domestic situations and how it's portrayed to the outside world? I mean, where is it promotion of democracy and where is it hypocrisy in some ways?
You know, it's exactly what I was thinking about. To go back to Anders, or the Prime Minister, I have the same issue in calling him Anders when he's a previous Prime Minister, but the point about Freedom House, I was at the Freedom House annual report release, I think in 2015, when they were taking France, my home country, about one of the examples of how quickly civil liberties can go down. I think it was the year where France lost the most points after the introduction of a state of emergency and so on. And I think this is the whole issue. When we talk about democracy, especially in our global movement, where we have people in over 120 countries, I'm French. If I start speaking about this, everyone starts looking at me, not anymore because we've had this discussion, so honestly, but at first we're like, I'm sorry, but who are you to talk about this? Do you know what your country has done in the last 100 years when it comes to democracies and promotion of democracies abroad. And I think this is the essential element. We have to be able to hold ourselves accountable and be honest. And there has to be, along with this, I think, a global reconciliation effort about having those difficult conversations about the historical roles all democracies have played in newer democracies' systems. And I think there also has to be kind of like what Freedom House does. We have to evaluate how democracies are doing on a day-to-day basis. So of course, there's always the threat of Russia, of China, of so many authoritarian countries, and we have to present a united front. But in the meanwhile, there's also the threats happening at home to democracies by governments, whether it's really extended states of emergencies that are cracking down on the rights of citizens and the rights to protest, or internet shutdowns in certain countries, or women's rights being cracked down upon, or prisoners after they leave prisons and have been rehabilitated not having a right to vote. And it's not like the biggest democracies on earth have a perfect track record. So I think it's about addressing those issues with democracies that we have in our own countries, while at the same time acknowledging that there is an urgency in acting and that we will never be perfect, but at least we try to hold each other accountable and ourselves accountable so that we can come to the table with a straight face and actually be able to have an honest conversation and not just one talking about the big mean guy across the world that is trying to, destroy democracy overall.
Thank you. We have so many questions that are coming in, and I want to encourage everyone when they send in a question, please introduce yourselves. Again, we're not seeing your faces, so it'd be good to know who you are. And if you also have a question specifically for one of the panelists, just let us know. So we have a question from Joe Mitchell. What counts as democracy? Who gets to decide what a democracy is and who could be in an alliance? Anders, I see you smiling, so maybe you have a thought on that. Yeah,
because it is obviously a very good question. And you have to set up a set of, so to speak, objective criteria. But I already mentioned some of them. Of course, you should pursue free and fair elections. You should have a free press, freedom of expression, rule of law, including an independent judiciary, etc. So you can set up a number of criteria. Who should decide? Well, that's a very good question. But as I see it, I think around 90 to 100 countries around the world would qualify for becoming members of such an alliance of democracies. And maybe the D10 or D11 or whatever it might end up being that Mark Sedwell described could be a committee that could set those criteria in stone, so to speak. I fully agree that it should be an inclusive alliance. So it should be an attractive alliance. I think, as Mark Sedwell mentioned, we could introduce a sort of an economic Article 5. That is, if one member of this alliance is attacked economically, then the other members would come to the aid of that country, for instance, Australia or whatever. So it should be an attractive alliance. You could also agree on free trade deals, etc. So it should be attractive to be a member. But to be a member, you must qualify. But no one is prohibited in advance. If you change your system, if you really becomes a democracy that fulfills the criteria, then you could join the club. And I couldn't think of a better group than the D10, 11, 12, or whatever to set the criteria.
Excellent. If anyone else, please, we're all friends here.
I think if I may, just very briefly, I think Anders is being slightly shy in not reminding us that there are a set of criteria that have applied in Europe for a very long time called the Copenhagen criteria, which he articulated. He was very modest in not calling them that, but which actually were set down as the political criteria for countries to be able to accede to the European Union. Now, of course, countries can go backwards, as a couple of of us have referred to. But I think there is a pretty good understanding out there of, as Anders said, of what it takes to be part of that kind of world, which doesn't have to be culturally insensitive either. There are ways of ensuring that we're discussing with countries with very different cultural backgrounds to the European cultural background, how those underlying principles that Anders was referring to, of pluralism and rule of law and free press, etc., can apply in different cultural situations. It mustn't be seen as a Western thing. The yearning for democracies is as strong in societies with very different histories and cultural backgrounds.
Excellent. So there's another interesting question that came in. It's from an anonymous person, sadly, but it makes me think about a follow-up too, could you reflect on the effect of diplomacy that isolates and confronts democracies by a solid, unified democratic front? What scenarios for transformation of a dictatorship to democratic rules and practices do you imagine and perhaps project? It kind of makes me, so I was a foreign correspondent for 13 years and I've covered strongman dictatorships and military dictatorships. And it sort of makes me wonder if there's a formula for any of these specific cases of, a dictatorship run by a strongman or a woman, a dictatorship run by a military. Is there a way to sort of lure them to a democracy? And perhaps, is there a different formula depending on what the country is going through? Maybe too complex a question.
Well,
I mean,
let me take a stab at it, if I might. I don't think there's one playbook, because different countries find themselves in different geopolitical contexts. But that said, we have, as democracies, we have an obligation, I think, to shape the incentive structure. And we're not always going to succeed, because we're not always going to have the tools or the resources to be able to effectuate change in certain countries. But we can stand with democratic movements. And, take the example of today's Belarus, where you have a very strong nationwide democratic movement that is struggling against a vicious authoritarian regime under Alexander Lukashenko. It is my view that democracies should be standing with that movement, should be applying sanctions to the agents of repression that Lukashenko uses to try to put down this movement, and should be putting on the table, and by who should be doing it, I mean principally the US and the EU, should be putting on the table a plan for the economic reconstruction of Belarus if and when they have a true governance transition to a more democratic society, so that the people see that there is a future there, and that we're not just simply leaving Belarus to the devices of Lukashenko and potentially his supporters in the Kremlin. So will we succeed in turning Belarus into a democracy? Well, that's for the people of Belarus to determine, frankly. It's not as if the United States or Brussels or any other European country can make that decision for them, but we can help shape the incentive structure.
But what happens then, my own follow-up is, what happens then when the will of the people is carried out and it's not exactly how Western allies would like to see it happen? I mean, I myself covered elections in the Palestinian territories that went to Hamas. You had Egypt that went from Hosni Mubarak to the military, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to a military government. A lot of times it doesn't actually play out the way Western countries would like. And you're actually seeing allies who are being drawn further apart from the US because of that. Where does the US then come in and say, well, we can still work together with these countries, even though they're completely defying these ideals that we try to promote? Where do you find middle ground between trying to work with those countries and also trying to enforce and crack the whip on them without them just saying, you know what, to hell with you guys, we're going to do whatever we want to do?
Well, I'll let others jump in, but just very quickly, I think that, sure, we see demagogic populists elected through free and fair elections, and we have to respect the will of the people in those cases. But we also have our interests to protect, and we should be encouraging countries that are run by demagogic leaders to respect things like independence of the media, independence of the judiciary, rule of law, market freedoms. And if they don't, then they gravitate away from that core center of democracies that we've been talking about. So we have tools at our disposal, but of course we have to recognize that, you know, each society that is governed by a nation state has the right to elect its leaders, and sometimes those leaders will not be in perfect alignment with how we see things.
Interesting.
If I can,
yeah, please.
just build on what Michael was just saying,
Please.
Because I think the Egypt example is a really interesting one. It's a reminder there's more to democracy than just elections, and it's often the case if you had a very repressive regime for a long period, as we had in Egypt, that the only organised opposition is really hardline, and in that case, of course, with a strong extreme religious component to it, and so there's a difficult balance to be struck during these transitions about do you immediately move to elections, in which case it may well be that the kind of moderate secular forces who haven't been able to organise themselves and have been repressed under the previous system simply don't have time to organise, or do you have some kind of transitional arrangement in order to try and ensure that those elements in society can organise? The risk of transitional arrangements, of course, is they aren't temporary, or they don't end up being temporary. You can perpetuate a new oligarchy. And these are just really difficult things to get right. And as Michael says, all we can do from the outside is try and get the incentive structures right. There are some really good examples, though. South Korea moved from being an autocratic military-run government that actually, of course, was economically successful. They ran a successful economic system that realized, though, if they were going to maintain that position, they had to start to liberalize, and did so actually over a relatively few number of years, a couple of presidential terms. We've seen in South Africa an example of a country that's had democratic forms since the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela, that was clearly sliding in the wrong direction under Zuma. And all of those elements that both Anders and Michael referred to, of corruption, cronyism, gerrymandering, use of state power to essentially exclude the effective opposition, were being deployed. But actually, the South Africans have managed to pull it back in the right direction with their last election. So I think there are many examples out there, and really the role of other democracies is to try and set the right incentive structure, and as Colombe was saying, of course, set the right example too.
That's right. And Colombe, we've got a question here actually that fleshes out a little bit something that you were talking about earlier. It says, how can we gatekeep and optimize inclusion and accountability, particularly in light of the fact that the EU and Council of Europe still have members that are operating far out and out of step with the liberal, democratic, and human rights standards?
And I think that's in my opinion, one of the biggest issues of the EU in the first place is that those now non-democratic countries are still part of the European Union with very little sanctions being imposed. And I think this is why we need a new body. And I saw a few comments as well asking why we should create a new body when previous ones have failed and so on. But I think this is exactly why we need a new multilateral alliance or formal organization working to preserve democracy. But I think the difference here for me is that the primary purpose of this League or Alliance of Democracies should be democracy. And it shouldn't be a body that would erode from the G7 that has a primary purpose that is different, an economic purpose, but one whose primary purpose is to protect, promote, and innovate democracy so that all other competences that might be given to it in the future would be secondary. And as a result, countries and the membership to this club, alliance, league, again, whatever you want to call it, would be completely dependent on democratic practices. And would not be put in the background if you have an advantageous trade deal or something else. But if I can just also bounce on the previous question quickly, I think there's another issue with how a League of Democracy could shape the future of the world. So I completely agree that you have different set of sanctions or models and incentives that work and have worked in the past. For example, sanctions worked in Peru in creating not new elections, but in democratizing the institutions. But I think with China, for example, we face another issue. A lot of people thought for a very long time that once China reached a certain level of prosperity, people would want democracy. And in the movement, we talk a lot with our Chinese members, for whom this is a big issue, because they tell us, look, we really thought that our friends and family would change their minds. And now that a lot of people are more middle class, have a better life than their parents, we actually see that the complete opposite is happening. People now are more supporting the government and its non-democratic practices than the previous generation. And I think here it's about the League of Democracies, or again, whatever body you create, capable of providing a compelling alternative. So not just in terms of sanctions or incentives, but in terms of creating an alternative that works economically, but also that provides a vision for a future world that is not just, again, a reminiscence of the past with the same countries just trying to preserve the status quo, but actually providing a strong vision for democracies where all countries would be welcome to input and where all people would be able to participate.
Thank you for that. So we have about 2.5 minutes left. And I'm going to take a question from Juha Mastonen. It's addressed to Anders, but by all means, if anyone wants to chime in very quickly, how can we promote EU-US discussion on Alliance of Democracies as well as a possible global summit? How are we going to work together? Anders, please.
Yeah, that's the key question. I think Biden as such is very much committed to this pledge. I think actually he got the inspiration in Copenhagen in 2018 when he inaugurated our Copenhagen Democracy Summit. He made a very strong speech at that, on that occasion, and he repeated this in his electoral platform and pledged to organize and host a summit in, I think, the latter part of 2021. So I have sent him 2 letters already offering our assistance in all respects that we can. The European Union has actually adopted a paper in which they outline areas where the EU and the US could work together, and democracy, promoting democracy, protecting democracy is one of those areas. So I think the platform has, the framework has now been created, and I hope the Biden administration will now work actively to organize and host that summit in the US, I suppose.
Well, thank you so much. Sadly, we'll have to leave it there because we are out of time. Thank you so much to all our speakers from all over the world and to our audience from all over the world for joining us. It's been a real honor for me. And you've been watching the #DefendDemocracy event for the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Wherever you are joining us from, please be safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful day or evening. Thanks.